Hey YouTube, it's your girl Stacy Celeste, and as promised in my last video, I wanted to come in and do a reading diary for my recent read of the Autobiography of Malcolm X, as told by Alex Haley. So first things first, on a reading diary for me, I've done it different ways in the past, but I think my biggest goal of a reading diary is to just kind of ask questions and have more of a conversation with the author, a conversation with the context of the story and everything like that. So as I read, I do typically annotate, and I wanted to use this type of a platform to kind of go through those annotations, discuss the things that really didn't sit well or the things that really did sit well for me as I've read certain books. And my goal is to keep it as short as possible. There's a lot here. This book, there's a lot here. So what I think I might do is either make this multi-part, or I might just continue to reference it in different reading diaries as I continue to kind of explore the Nation of Islam, to explore Malcolm X, and explore this time period in America a little bit more in depth. And even more, I think more so what I'll get into in this video, I want to explore the role of Black women in the Civil Rights Movement a lot more. We live in a patriarchal society. We live in a society where we tend to hear the stories of men a lot more, or at least stories from the perspective of men. And this was definitely a story from the perspective of men. However, in reading it, you are able to see some, of the women in Malcolm X's life who facilitated and allowed him to engage the way that he engaged, and even to explore the world. So I wanted to kind of focus this on that, on the women in his life, or at least his ideologies around women, because it's the space in reading this that is what made it the most difficult for me to read this book. All right, so the first quote that I'm going to read is from page 95 in this rendition, the mass market copy of this book. And this is with respect to, this is when Malcolm X was before he was saved by the Nation of Islam. And he was out in the streets. He was a hustler. These are some of his observations. So it says, "It was husbands who had left their homes in time to stop by St. Nicholas Avenue House before they went to work." St. Nicholas Avenue House, this was a whorehouse, I guess you would say, where prostitutes are and everything. So he was kind of working with those women, or directing the men to the house. So he had a hustle going on in that space. So this is just his observations there. So he goes on, "Of course, not the same ones every day, but always enough of them to make the rush. And it included white men who had come in cabs all the way from downtown. Domineering, complaining, demanding wives who had just about psychologically castrated their husbands were responsible for the early rush. These wives were so disagreeable and had made their men so tense that they were robbed of the satisfaction of being men. To escape this tension and the chance of being ridiculed by their own wife, each of these men had gotten up early and came to a prostitute. The prostitutes had to make it their business to be students of men. They said that after most men passed their virile 20s, they went to bed mainly to satisfy their egos, and because a lot of women don't understand it that way, they damage and wreck a man's ego. No matter how little virility a man has to offer in the world, that's why these prostitutes had that morning rush of business. More wives could keep their husbands if they realized their greatest urge is to be men. All right, so that's the first one. What you'll see is that, or what I saw, is that there's a continual use of the word domineering. And I had to, throughout the book, only to describe women. I didn't notice it to describe anything else or anybody else, but the word domineering to describe women, especially Black women, was used on multiple occasions. And what that means, domineering, I looked it up, it says asserting one's will over another in an arrogant way. So it's definitely a negative term. So let me move on and read another quote. I want to get these quotes out the way before I actually go into the conversation. I assumed that Reginald is Malcolm X's younger brother. I assumed that Reginald, like most of the Negroes I knew, would go for a white woman. I point out Negro happy women to him and explain that a Negro with any brains could wrap these women around his fingers. But I have to say this for Reginald. He never liked white women. I remember that one time he met Sophia. He was so cool it upset Sophia and it tickled me. Reginald got himself a black woman. I guess she was pushing 30 or an old settler, as we called them back in those days. She was a waitress in an exclusive restaurant downtown. She lavished on Reginald everything she had. She was so happy to get a young man. I mean, she bought him clothes, cooked and washed for him and everything as though he was a baby. That was just another example of why my respect for my younger brother kept increasing. Reginald showed in often surprising ways more sense than a lot of working hustlers twice his age. Reginald then was only 16, but a 6-footer. He looked and acted much older than his years. All right, so I have so many here, but I'm just going to do one more, and I might end up doing, another one. But we'll do one more here, and then we'll start to talk a little bit. All right, so last but not least, on page 230, this is when Malcolm X was ingrained into the Nation of Islam. It was after he got out of prison where he was introduced to the Nation of Islam and where he was actually a minister now in New York City, I believe. So let's go here. So every month when I went to Chicago, I would find that some sister had written complaining to Mr. Muhammad that I talked so hard against women when I taught our special classes about the different natures of the two X's. Now, Islam has very strict laws and teachings about women, the core of them being that the true nature of a man is to be strong and a woman's true nature is to be weak. And while a man must at all times respect his woman, at the same time he needs to understand that he must control her if he expects to get her respect. But in those days, I had my own personal reason. I wouldn't have considered it possible for me to love any woman. I'd had too much experience that women were only tricky, deceitful, untrustworthy flesh. I had seen too many men guided, or at least tied down, or in some other way messed up by women. Women talk too much. To tell a woman not to talk too much was like telling Jesse James not to carry a gun or telling a hen not to cackle. Can you imagine Jesse James without a gun or a hen that didn't cackle? And if anyone in any kind of leadership position, such as I was, the worst thing in the world that he could have was the wrong woman. Even Samson, the world's strongest man, was destroyed by the woman who slept in his arms. She was the one whose words hurt him. I mean, I had so much experience. I had talked to too many prostitutes and mistresses. They knew more about a whole lot of husbands than the wives of those husbands did. The wives always filled their husbands' ears so full of wife complaints that it wasn't the wives, it was the prostitutes and mistresses who heard the husband's innermost problems and secrets. They thought of him and comforted him, and that included listening to him, so he would tell them everything. So let me do one more because I want to get the in the epilogue, Alex Haley talks about Malcolm X. He's able to kind of observe Malcolm X, and so I will give you a quick quote from the epilogue, which is Alex Haley's impression on Malcolm X and his experience in creating this autobiography with him. So let me see. It was through a clue, and this is Alex Haley speaking. It was through a clue from one of the scribblings that finally I cast a bait that Malcolm X took. Quote, woman who cries all the time is only because she knows she can get away with it, he had scribbled. I somehow raised the subject of women suddenly between sips of coffee and further scribbling and doodling. He vented his criticisms and skepticisms of women. Quote, "You never can truly trust any," he said. "I've got the only one I've ever met whom I would trust 75%. I've told her that," he said. "I've told her like I tell you. I've seen too many men destroyed by their wives or their women. I don't completely trust anyone," he went on, "not even myself. I've seen too many men destroy themselves. Other people I trust from not at all. Other people I trust from not at all to highly, like the Honorable Elijah Muhammad." Malcolm X looked squarely at me. "You, I trust about 25%. Trying to keep Malcolm X talking, I mined the woman theme for all it was worth. Triumphantly, he exclaimed, "Do you know why Benedict Arnold turned traitor? A woman," he said. "Whatever else a woman is, I don't care who the woman is. It starts with her being vain. I'll prove it's something you can do anytime you want, and I know what I'm talking about. I've done it. You think of the hardest looking, meanest acting woman you know, one of those whom men never smiles. Well, every day you see that woman, you look her right in the eyes and you tell her, 'I think you're beautiful,' and you watch what happens. The first day she may curse you out, the second day too, but you watch, you keep on. After a while, one day she's going to start smiling just as soon as you come into sight." I just read you 4 different quotes, 2 of the quotes being from before Malcolm X joined the Nation of Islam, 1 quote while he was in the Nation of Islam, and then the other was a quote from Alex Haley in the epilogue. So that was while Malcolm, I believe, was still in the Nation of Islam, but I wanted to read it because what I loved about the epilogue and what I feel like was so important about the epilogue is that Alex Haley experienced Malcolm X. So it wasn't what Malcolm X wanted to be said, but it was what Alex Haley experienced in being face to face with him. And so I wanted to include that because to me, that is probably one of the most insightful quotes for me as I was looking through everything. So I was very, very uncomfortable and completely disheartened going through the majority of this book and reading quotes like that one. So much so that even before I got to the epilogue, I decided to go ahead and post on Instagram. I'll show you guys what I posted on Instagram when it came with regards to this particular story. I think that ultimately, you know, like I said earlier, how I was taught Malcolm X didn't include the misogyny. It didn't include it. Now, the Nation of Islam, I think, is known for, being, maybe not the best place for women. And granted, I was not a part of the Nation of Islam. I did not grow up in the Nation of Islam. I think that there's a lot of, I don't want to bash the nation because I do believe that there was a lot of positivity within the Nation of Islam, particularly during the time when it was the most popular, not just for black men, but also for black women and creating structure. Malcolm X talks about, getting people off of drugs and a lot of different things. So the community as a whole, I think, benefited from having the Nation of Islam be a part of it. But at the same time, I think that there's some areas of it that kind of were destructive for women. So what came up for me is this story, or this small little pamphlet from Audre Lorde. This is what kind of came into my head, and I'm not sure if it's focusing well, but it's "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." Now that's the title, and then it's also, these are like little essays by Audre Lorde. And what resonated was that, in even reading these quotes, number one was that while, Bell Hooks said it, she's the one that got me thinking this way, was that, you can't get rid of white supremacy without getting rid of patriarchy. You can't get rid of patriarchy without getting rid of white supremacy and any other power structure, whether it's imperialism or any of these other power structures that are destructive to communities of people. You can't get rid of one without getting rid of the other, because they have the same mechanism for power. Malcolm X talks about the black man a lot. He talks about, the white man being on the black man's neck. But if you listen to these comments and you listen to how his language around black women, I can hear a lot of the language that white people have about black people kind of in it. So it's almost the same ideology that, this is you're less than, you're not designed. God didn't even design you to be on my level. It's the same, to me, the same dialogue, except instead of talking about white people talking about black people, it's these black men, putting that on black women. You can hear that very much so in the passage from when he was with the nation. And he says here, now Islam has very strict laws and teachings about women, the core of them being that the true nature of a man is to be strong and a woman's true nature is to be weak. To me, that sounds a lot about very similar to when white people talk about black people and that, that our true nature is not to be intelligent, that we're not intelligent enough. It's just to be physical and physical beings that can mine and work these fields and things like that. So, like I said, this came to mind because it basically says it that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I feel like this brand of activism is rooted in a lot of the same principles of what they're fighting against. And you can see it in how women are being discussed and talked about throughout the book. I think what is even more interesting and what makes it a more dynamic conversation is, number one, Malcolm X has 5 daughters. One actually passed away, I believe. So, but when he died, he didn't have any sons. And then on top of that, his wife Betty, the same man that he gave 100% of his trust into, Elijah Muhammad, is the same man who, I don't know if it's proven or not, but who was responsible for his death in a lot of ways. Now, you guys can probably argue me down on that or whatever, but him turning his back on Malcolm X for the reasons that he turned his back on Malcolm X, which I believe is, mostly through jealousy. Obviously Malcolm X was kind of speaking his mind about certain things, but he devoted his whole entire life to this man and trusted him 100%. And it ended up being a huge aspect of his demise as a person. Yet you have your wife who has stuck by your side through all of this, is answering your calls, is receiving death threats, is having your kids here, having to, see the house get burned down and supporting you through all of that. You have your sister Ella who has financed you to go to Mecca, who financed you to actually get another house for your family. You have your mother, so there's, to me, the pillars of what made Malcolm X be able to be Malcolm X were women. And I would believe that if he got an opportunity to live longer, that he probably would have, in seeing his daughters grow up and teaching his daughters, and at the end I believe he was wanting to spend more time with his family. I think that you would have seen him get more, change maybe some of his thoughts, just like he changed his thoughts with regards to the Nation of Islam and Orthodox Islam. But I think you'll start to see some of those changes. But to me, it's very, very complicated to kind of see how big an influence these women had in your life, a positive influence that these women had in your life, and also hear this type of rhetoric. And how does he reconcile that rhetoric with, you know, his experiences with his wife and his daughters and his sisters, you know, and his mother? Like, how does he reconcile that rhetoric? I don't know that he thought about it. I don't know. But that was something that really got to me. Another point that I wanted to make too is that he did have a lot of, I don't want to say reverence for Orthodox Islam, especially when he went to Mecca. But there was also some kind of language around, you know, women not being seen, and how that was almost a paradise and that type of thing. But to me, when I think about the areas that he visited, these are areas where, you know, women don't have the same type of rights even here. He had another comment that I didn't read, and he talked about how you can judge a society based on how women dress. And, you know, in Western societies, the women, and these were, you know, I don't know his exact words, but the Western societies, the women dressed maybe a little bit more provocative. And I don't know, provocative it is. If he saw how people dress now, I think he would be like, wait, what? But he's saying that the people in areas where the women dress more provocative, those, you know, countries were more, what is the word? Less morals. There was less morals, more immorality in some of their structures and things like that. Whereas in these Middle Eastern areas, the women dressed, you know, more modestly, and that he said he could tell that the society was more moral because of how the women dressed. So it's just, to me, there's such a large emphasis on women, and I feel like women are put in this box, and they are almost made to be they're almost like the devil. Because, you know, he calls like the white devil. I mean, sometimes I'm like, dang, he could really change that language and call it a women devil. Like, it's very aggressive. It's very aggressive. And so ultimately for me, Malcolm X was an incredible person. He was very smart, very self-aware. He thought about a lot of things, but he was in a society at a time where, you know, I don't know if he had all the tools. I don't know if anybody at the time had the tools or the language to really have an intersectional conversation about race, about patriarchy, about politics, about all of this. And I think moving forward, what this type of book can motivate us to do is make sure that we are not just having one-dimensional conversations, that we're having intersectional conversations with different types of people. If we're talking about race, we need to have conversations with women and with their perspective on race, the race issue is. We need to have conversations with LGBTQ plus people. We need to have conversations with people who are disabled, people who are veterans that also are Black, you know, like, so we really have to take into account all the stories of Black people, all the perspectives of Black people, if we really want to find answers to questions or really want to move the ball and the needle forward. And I think if we really take into account everybody's perspective and what everybody thinks, then we will not only be finding solutions to the race issue in America, but also patriarchy, also imperialism, also all these things. So I think moving forward for me that, you know, this is a catalyst, but it's flawed. And that's beautiful, because Malcolm X is a catalyst, but he's a man. He's a man. He's not a god. He was not a god. He is a man, and he is very intelligent. And I believe that Malcolm X was more of an experience. He's someone that, you know, regardless of what he's saying, he takes over the room. his aura and his energy. And to me, that's what made him special. To me, that's what got people to really, you know, want to engage and be around him and listen to him, because of how he spoke, because of how he led. And I think, if anything, that's something that we can always learn from and try to embody. So yeah, I hope this made a lot of sense. For me, I think I mentioned it earlier, if I don't cut it out, I want to continue to read. There's a couple of books that are out there. This one came out to me because I was in the market, or I was kind of looking for something that gives me some insight on the women in Malcolm X's life. And this came out. I will put the picture on the screen here, but it's called Three Mothers: How the Mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped the Nation. And it's by who is her name? I'll put her name up here too. I don't see the name of the author here. But that's a book that I want to dive into and try to read a little bit more. I also want to read some of the books that Malcolm X read while he was in jail. I think that will kind of give some insight into his ideology and his perspectives once he gets out, or even his processes once he gets out of jail. Overall, I think that, you know, I highly recommend this book to anybody. But I also recommend that you read it from the space of understanding that it is not necessarily it's not a how-to book. You have to read this with a conscious mind, and you have to read it and ask questions and things like that. Talk to different people about it. That's kind of be how I think this book should be read. I am so excited to hear what you guys have to say. This is a open space. My goal is ultimately to have conversations that lead to some type of execution, whether it be in our day-to-day lives, or how we speak to each other, or something even bigger. So yes, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will catch you in the next video. Peace out. Bye guys.